The year 1884 arrived in the soot-choked town of Raven Valley, Pennsylvania, not with the gentle whisper of a new dawn, but with the brutal, freezing strike of an iron hammer. Nestled deep within the shadowed, claustrophobic depths of the Allegheny Mountains, Raven Valley was a place defined entirely by its proximity to the earth. It was a coal town, a bleak industrial wound carved into the steep hillsides, where the sky was perpetually stained the color of bruised iron by the belching smoke of the colossal mining breakers. The sun rarely breached the thick, oppressive canopy of smog, leaving the valley floor trapped in a permanent, freezing twilight. The streets were slick with freezing black mud, and the air was thick with the sharp, metallic taste of pulverized anthracite and the desperate, bone-deep exhaustion of the men who spent their lives buried alive for pennies a day. It was a town that understood the dark better than it understood the light, and it was a town that had learned, through generations of hard labor and quiet tragedies, to never ask questions about the things that preferred to stay hidden. Looming high above this grim, industrial basin, completely isolated on a steep, treacherous ridge of black granite, sat Hemlock Manor. It was a massive, sprawling Victorian estate, an architectural monument to staggering, ruthless wealth and unchecked arrogance. Built entirely from dark, imported stone and heavy slate, it featured towering, needle-like turrets and deep, shadowed verandas that seemed to actively absorb whatever weak sunlight managed to pierce the smog. But in the bitter winter of 1884, Hemlock Manor was not a symbol of prosperity. It was a rotting, silent tomb. The massive iron gates had been chained shut for exactly 10 years. The high, arched windows on the upper floors were completely dark, their heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the world. The expansive, meticulously manicured lawns had long since succumbed to aggressive mountain briars and dead, freezing weeds. Yet, the house was not entirely abandoned. Every single night, as the bruised sky turned completely black, a single, weak, flickering amber light would appear. But it did not shine from the grand parlor or the master bedroom. It burned faintly, stubbornly, from a small iron-barred window set deep into the heavy stone foundation of the manor. It was the cellar. It was the sole domain of Margaret Hemlock. A decade prior, Margaret had been a vibrant, strikingly beautiful woman, a prominent, highly educated socialite from Philadelphia who had married into the valley's brutal royalty. Her husband, Elias Hemlock, was the undisputed baron of the Raven Valley coal seams. He was a colossal, terrifying man, known throughout the county for his explosive temper, his ruthless, practically feudal control over the miners, and his staggering, terrifyingly deep debts accrued through reckless, high-stakes gambling in the underground parlors of Pittsburgh. He was a tyrant who ruled both his mines and his marriage with an iron fist and a leather crop. Then, in the freezing, chaotic winter of 1874, Elias Hemlock simply vanished. He rode out of the manor grounds in a heavy, black carriage during a blinding blizzard and was never seen again. The town, exhausted by his cruelty, collectively exhaled. The local authorities, well aware of Elias's massive gambling debts and the dangerous men he owed money to, quickly concluded he had fled the state under the cover of the storm to escape ruin or a shallow grave. They did not search hard, but it was Margaret's reaction that birthed the chilling, whispered legend of the widow of Raven Valley. She did not report him missing. She did not contact the authorities. She did not weep, nor did she attempt to salvage the rapidly collapsing Hemlock mining empire. On the very night Elias vanished, Margaret Hemlock descended the heavy stone stairs into the cavernous, freezing cellar of the manor, and she locked the massive, iron-reinforced oak door behind her. She never came back upstairs. For 10 agonizing years, she had lived exclusively beneath the floorboards of her own home, unseen by any living soul, her existence confirmed only by that single, flickering lantern light burning behind the iron grate. Before we unlock the heavy oak door and descend into the terrifying dark of that cellar, I'd like to take a quick moment to welcome you. If you are captivated by these dark, forgotten chapters of history and the chilling mysteries that refuse to stay buried, it would mean the world to me if you'd subscribe to the channel. We unearth these stories together, and your support is what allows me to keep digging. Now, let's return to the freezing cold of Raven Valley, where a 10-year-old silence was about to be violently broken. The town, hardened and deeply superstitious, largely ignored the eccentricities of the ruined widow, but she could not survive on the freezing mountain air alone. Her sole connection to the outside world, her only tenuous thread to humanity, was Thomas Finch. Finch was the local grocer, an older, deeply nervous, and deeply indebted man whose small, soot-stained shop sat at the base of the Hemlock Ridge. Once a week, precisely at dusk on a Tuesday, Finch would trudge up the treacherous, freezing, overgrown path to the manor, pulling a small, heavy wooden cart. He would approach the iron ground-level grate that opened directly into the cellar. He would not speak. He would simply kneel in the freezing mud, and a moment later, a pale, heavily trembling, and impossibly thin hand would slowly slide a single, pristine $20 gold double eagle through the rusted iron bars. It was a staggering sum of money in 1884, vastly overpaying for the supplies, a silent bribe ensuring absolute, unwavering discretion. In exchange for the gold, Finch would drop heavy canvas sacks of meager, non-perishable rations down the iron chute: dried salted beef, hardtack, heavy bags of flour, and gallons of strong kerosene for her lantern. But it was the other items Margaret demanded, scrawled frantically on small, torn pieces of heavy parchment passed through the grate, that deeply terrified the grocer. They were not the requests of a grieving widow or a woman simply seeking isolation. Along with the food, Finch was ordered to deliver massive, back-breaking quantities of raw, industrial cement mix, heavy iron railroad spikes, thick steel chains, and large jugs of caustic quicklime. Week after week, year after year, the frail woman in the cellar dragged hundreds of pounds of construction material into the pitch black. She was not just surviving down there. She was actively, desperately building something. This terrifying, bizarre routine had continued uninterrupted for an entire decade. But as the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1884 descended upon the Allegheny Mountains, bringing with it sub-zero temperatures and blinding walls of snow, the routine violently shattered. On a freezing Tuesday evening in late November, Thomas Finch arrived at the local precinct, his face practically blue with cold, his eyes wide with a frantic, undeniable terror. He slammed his frozen, gloved hands onto the scarred wooden desk of Constable Silas Reed, his voice breaking as he spoke. The pristine gold coins had stopped coming. The heavy sacks of flour and salted beef from the previous week were still sitting at the bottom of the iron chute, rotting and entirely untouched. And worse, Finch stammered, his breath pluming in the freezing air of the precinct. A putrid, unbearable, and highly concentrated smell of profound rot and caustic chemicals was now aggressively rising from the cellar grates, bleeding out into the freezing mountain wind. The widow of Raven Valley had finally stopped ordering cement, and it was time for the law to find out why. Constable Silas Reed was not a man given to flights of fancy or the panicked, superstitious ramblings of the soot-stained locals who populated the isolated mining camps of the Allegheny Mountains. He was a creature of intense logic and cold, unyielding rationality, a hardened veteran of the brutal city precincts of Philadelphia who had specifically requested the geographically isolated post of Raven Valley for its presumed lack of complex, civilized deceit. But as he looked at the terrified, practically vibrating form of Thomas Finch shivering violently in his office, the heavy, undeniable weight of a very real, physical tragedy settled deeply into the constable's bones. He dismissed the frantic, stammering grocer with a stern, absolute warning to keep his mouth firmly shut, pulled his heavy wool greatcoat tightly over his broad, stiff shoulders, and strapped his heavy, state-issued Colt service revolver to his hip. He ordered his youngest deputy, a nervous, deeply superstitious local boy named Miller whose hands were already trembling, to immediately retrieve 2 heavy iron fire axes and a pair of brass kerosene lanterns from the precinct's cramped storage closet. The hike up the jagged, black granite ridge toward Hemlock Manor was a grueling, agonizing battle against the sheer, violent force of the elements. The winter storm had drastically intensified as the afternoon bled into evening, transforming the steep, heavily overgrown wagon trail into a treacherous, knee-deep river of freezing, unbroken snow. The wind howled aggressively down through the skeletal, ice-coated pines like a chorus of dying animals, violently whipping the sharp, stinging sleet against the men's exposed faces until their skin was entirely numb and practically raw. looming high above them at the absolute precipice of the ridge, completely swallowed by the suffocating, bruise-colored twilight. The massive Victorian estate looked less like a home and infinitely more like a colossal, rotting mausoleum holding its breath in the freezing dark. The heavy, wrought iron front gates of the vast property were frozen entirely solid, completely choked by a decade of aggressive, dead mountain briars and thick, impenetrable layers of black ice. Reed and Miller were forced to violently smash the rusted padlocks with the blunt, heavy heads of their axes, the metallic, explosive cracks echoing sharply and aggressively across the desolate, silent ridge, instantly swallowed by the howling wind. Stepping cautiously onto the expansive, decaying wraparound wooden veranda, their boots crunching loudly on the frosted floorboards, they found the massive, double oak front doors surprisingly unresisting. They had not been locked in 10 years. The true, impenetrable fortress lay elsewhere. As the heavy doors groaned open on completely rusted hinges, kicking up a thick, suffocating cloud of disturbed, freezing air, the men stepped carefully over the threshold and into a deeply unsettling, practically frozen time capsule. The grand, sprawling interior of Hemlock Manor was a breathtaking, horrifying museum of a life violently and abruptly abandoned in the dead winter of 1874. The staggering opulence of the missing coal baron's massive wealth was still painfully evident, but it was completely, uniformly blanketed in a thick, gray, absolutely undisturbed shroud of dust that clung to every single surface like a suffocating second skin. Massive crystal chandeliers hung entirely motionless from the high, vaulted ceilings, the delicate glass prisms completely dulled by dirt, neglect, and thick spiderwebs. Heavy, dark red velvet drapes were drawn tightly shut across the towering windows, crumbling slightly at the edges from years of unchecked dry rot. In the center of the grand parlor, a massive, ornate mahogany grandfather clock stood entirely silent, its heavy brass pendulum frozen permanently dead at exactly 1:15 midnight. On a beautifully carved, long dining table in the adjacent room, fine, imported porcelain teacups sat exactly where they had been deliberately placed a decade prior. The tea inside them had long since evaporated completely into nothingness, leaving only dark, bitter, oxidized stains at the bottom of the delicate china. There were absolutely no footprints in the incredibly thick dust coating the expensive Persian rugs. No one had walked these expansive, echoing halls in 10 years. The total, crushing, and absolute silence of the upper floors was deafening, making the frantic, terrifying reality of the widow living directly beneath their boots all the more incomprehensible. Reed raised his flickering brass lantern high, the weak amber light cutting a narrow path through the floating, disturbed motes of gray dust, and led the heavily breathing deputy toward the back of the grand estate. They moved slowly and methodically through the cavernous, shadow-drenched kitchen, their heavy boots leaving the very first violent marks on the pristine, dust-coated floorboards in a decade. Tucked away in the darkest, most claustrophobic corner of the sprawling butless pantry, completely obscured from the natural light of the upper house, they finally located the entrance to the cellar. It was a massive, incredibly thick door constructed of solid, dark-stained oak. But as Reed stepped closer, wiping a thick, heavy layer of grime from the wood with his gloved hand, the sheer, terrifying scale of Margaret Hemlock's profound, 10-year paranoia finally materialized in the dim lantern light. The door was not merely locked to keep desperate intruders out. It had been aggressively, meticulously, and heavily modified to ensure that whatever was inside could never, ever be breached by the outside world. Massive, heavy-gauge industrial steel plates had been violently bolted across the vertical seams of the wood, reinforcing the heavy oak against any physical impact. But crucially, the terrifying detail that made the blood run completely cold in the constable's veins was the locking mechanism itself. The thick, forged iron deadbolts, the heavy brass padlocks, and the massive, rusted drop bars were not located on the outside of the door. They were all situated firmly on the inside. Margaret had not descended into the dark simply to hide her grief from the town. She had retreated into the freezing, windowless depths of the stone foundation, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and systematically, frantically sealed herself in with an impenetrable, impossible wall of iron and steel. She had created a secure, subterranean vault, and she alone held the key. The realization that absolutely no living soul could have possibly entered or exited that cellar in 10 years hit Constable Reed with the force of a physical blow, violently confirming Thomas Finch's frantic, stammering fears from the precinct. The widow of Raven Valley was completely, utterly alone down there in the pitch black, and the absolute lack of movement, sound, or response to their heavy pounding on the reinforced oak door painted a grim, terrifying picture of what awaited them. Reed did not waste precious time shouting futile, authoritative commands into the suffocating silence of the pantry. He aggressively ordered Deputy Miller to stand back against the far wall, gripped the smooth, cold ashwood handle of his heavy fire axe with both hands, and swung the massive, wedge-shaped iron head directly into the absolute center of the reinforced oak. The deafening, explosive sound of splintering ancient wood and screaming, violently stressed metal completely shattered the 10-year silence of the decaying manor. Again and again, driven by a sudden surge of pure, adrenaline-fueled necessity, Reed brought the heavy axe down with devastating, brutal force. The physical exertion in the freezing, dust-choked air of the pantry was agonizing. It took the two desperate men nearly 40 grueling minutes of relentless, back-breaking, and incredibly loud labor to finally compromise the brutal structural integrity of the barricade. With one final, devastating, and entirely exhausted strike, the thick steel plates finally buckled, the internal forged iron deadbolts violently sheared from their heavy casings, and the ruined, violently splintered remains of the massive oak door collapsed inward down the stone steps with a heavy, echoing crash. As the heavy wooden barrier fell, the dense, entirely stagnant air that had been trapped completely beneath the earth for a decade instantly rushed up the narrow, claustrophobic stone steps to meet them. It hit the lawmen like a physical, suffocating wall. It was a freezing, thick, and abrasive draft that immediately burned their eyes and the backs of their throats, forcing them to cough violently into the dark. It carried the overpowering, caustic, chemical tang of massive, industrial quantities of raw quicklime and heavy, pulverized stone dust. But deeply intertwined within those harsh, burning, industrial odors was something infinitely worse. It was the distinct, undeniable, and deeply putrid stench of profound, biological decay, rising aggressively and heavily from the absolute pitch black of the cavernous cellar below. The lawmen stood entirely paralyzed at the threshold of the shattered oak door, their brass lanterns trembling violently in their heavily gloved hands as the suffocating, chemical draft washed over them. Constable Silas Reed, a man who had walked through the blood-soaked alleyways of Philadelphia without flinching, felt a cold, primal dread coil tightly at the base of his spine. He raised his lantern higher, but the weak, flickering amber beam seemed to be actively swallowed by the absolute, crushing darkness of the subterranean space. Gripping his heavy Colt revolver tightly, he ordered Deputy Miller to stay close, and together, they began the agonizing, deeply claustrophobic descent down the jagged, uneven stone steps. The silence of the cellar was not empty. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, the kind of absolute stillness that follows a deafening explosion. With every slow, calculated step they took into the pitch black, the temperature plummeted drastically, the freezing winter air of the upper house replaced by the deep, damp, bone-chilling cold of the unheated earth. Beneath the soles of their heavy leather boots, the stone steps were not slick with natural mountain moisture. They were thickly coated in a pale, gritty, and deeply caustic layer of pulverized stone dust and spilled quicklime that crunched loudly, violently echoing against the low, vaulted ceiling. As they finally reached the bottom of the long staircase, sweeping their lanterns across the vast, cavernous expanse of the foundation, the true, horrifying reality of Margaret Hemlock's 10-year isolation finally materialized in the shifting shadows. This was no longer a grand Victorian cellar designed for the storage of fine imported wines, cured meats, and winter coal. It had been aggressively, meticulously transformed into a terrifying, fortified subterranean bunker. Along the perimeter of the damp stone walls, stacked high like sandbags in a desperate, deeply paranoid military trench, were dozens of petrified, rock-hard canvas sacks of unused industrial cement. Rusted iron buckets, heavily caked with dried mortar, lay discarded and abandoned in the freezing dust, alongside dozens of empty, glass kerosene jugs. The space felt less like a living quarters and infinitely more like a grim, desperate last stand against an unseen, invading army. Reed swept his lantern beam slowly toward the far, darkest corner of the massive cellar, tracking the putrid, overwhelming smell of biological decay to its terrible source. There, positioned deliberately against the damp, freezing stone wall, was a simple, rough-hewn wooden rocking chair. And sitting rigidly upright within it, completely swallowed by the shadows, was the widow of Raven Valley. Margaret Hemlock was entirely, undeniably dead. The woman who had once been the vibrant, beautiful, and deeply envied socialite of the Allegheny Mountains had been reduced to a horrific, emaciated phantom. She was dressed in the rotting, moth-eaten remains of a heavy, dark Victorian morning dress, the expensive silk and velvet practically disintegrating off her skeletal frame. Her skin was a sickening, translucent parchment, stretched impossibly tight over her sharp cheekbones, entirely devoid of color after a decade without a single ray of natural sunlight. Her wide, unblinking eyes were frozen open, staring blankly and aggressively into the gloom with an expression of pure, unadulterated, and everlasting terror. In her frail, practically mummified lap, her bony fingers were curled in an absolute deathly vice grip around the stock and twin triggers of a heavy, severely rusted, double-barreled shotgun. The heavy weapon was fully loaded, its twin hammers pulled back and cocked, ready to violently discharge at a moment's notice. The county medical examiner would later confirm the tragic, deeply pathetic reality of her demise. Margaret Hemlock had not taken her own life in a fit of sudden, overwhelming despair, nor had she been murdered by an intruder breaking through the iron grates. She had died of sheer, absolute exhaustion and profound, systemic starvation. Her heart, subjected to an unbroken decade of relentless, paralyzing hypervigilance, freezing temperatures, and severe malnutrition, had simply, quietly given out in the dark. She had sat in that wooden rocking chair, awake and terrified, with her finger resting heavily on the triggers of her shotgun, until her body completely and utterly consumed itself. But as Constable Reed stepped closer to the tragic, rotting remains of the widow, a new, deeply unsettling realization began to gnaw at his logical mind. He looked at the rusted barrel of the shotgun resting across her knees. She was not aiming the heavy weapon at the shattered oak door they had just broken through. She was not aiming it at the small iron grate where Thomas Finch dropped her meager weekly supplies. The widow's wide, dead eyes and the twin muzzles of the cocked shotgun were pointed directly, unequivocally, at the absolute center of the vast cellar floor. Reed slowly turned his head, following her frozen, terrifying line of sight, and raised his brass lantern high to illuminate the middle of the dark room. What he saw sitting in the center of the subterranean vault stripped the breath entirely from his lungs and made the young Deputy Miller drop to his knees in the caustic dust, gagging violently. It was a massive, terrifyingly unnatural, and entirely incomprehensible architectural monolith. Sitting directly on the stone floor, reaching nearly to the low, vaulted ceiling of the cellar, was a colossal, heavy, and deeply grotesque mound. It was the horrific culmination of 10 years of backbreaking, solitary, and deeply manic labor. It was built entirely from thousands of pounds of roughly poured, heavily layered industrial concrete. But it was not just a simple pile of hardened stone. The massive concrete structure was violently, aggressively interwoven with the heavy, dark iron railroad ties and the incredibly thick, forged steel chains that the terrified grocer had been dropping down the chute for a decade. The heavy iron beams protruded from the jagged concrete like the broken, rusted ribs of a colossal, buried leviathan, wrapped tightly in layers of heavy steel chain that had been practically fossilized into the poured stone. It was a monument to pure, unfathomable paranoia. Margaret Hemlock, a frail, isolated woman, had spent an entire decade dragging hundreds of pounds of raw cement, caustic lime, and heavy iron across the freezing floor in the pitch black, mixing it by hand, and pouring it over this single, localized spot in the center of the room. It was a bunker built entirely within a bunker, a colossal, impenetrable seal designed to hold something incredibly heavy and deeply terrifying firmly beneath the earth. And she had spent the last 10 years of her tragic life sitting in a rocking chair, armed with a loaded shotgun, staring directly at it, completely terrified that whatever she had buried beneath the concrete was eventually going to break out. Before we call in the mining crews to break open this terrifying concrete tomb and uncover what the widow is guarding, I want to ask you all a quick question. Which country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. The heavy, suffocating silence of the cellar, a silence that had stretched unbroken for 10 agonizing years, was finally shattered the following morning not by ghosts, but by the brutal, deafening ring of industrial iron. Constable Silas Reed, standing before the colossal, iron-bound monolith of concrete, knew that whatever dark, terrifying secret the widow of Raven Valley had sealed within this subterranean tomb, it would require the raw, back-breaking strength of the town's primary industry to unearth it. He had firmly locked down the decaying manor, ordered the tragic, emaciated remains of Margaret Hemlock to be quietly removed by the county coroner under the cover of darkness, and marched directly back down the freezing, wind-battered ridge to the soot-stained heart of the mining town. Reed did not ask for police volunteers. Instead, utilizing the emergency discretionary funds of the precinct, he conscripted a specialized crew of 6 hardened anthracite miners. These were men whose lungs were already permanently stained black with coal dust, whose thick arms were corded with heavy muscle from years of swinging iron in the lightless, suffocating depths of the Allegheny earth. He did not tell them about the widow, the rocking chair, or the loaded shotgun. He simply informed them that they were to be paid triple their standard daily wage to dismantle a massive, unauthorized structural anomaly deep beneath the foundation of Hemlock Manor. The dismantling of Margaret's paranoid monument was not a swift excavation. It was a grueling, agonizing, 3-day siege. The cellar quickly devolved into a claustrophobic, hellish cacophony of ringing steel, shattering stone, and choking white dust. The miners, stripped down to their sweat-soaked undershirts despite the freezing ambient temperature of the unheated earth, swung massive 12-pound iron sledgehammers and drove long, hardened steel pry bars into the dense concrete. The structure was practically impenetrable, a testament to a decade of manic, terrified labor. Margaret had not simply poured cement, she had meticulously layered it, weaving the thick, heavy steel chains and forged iron railroad ties Thomas Finch had delivered into a practically indestructible subterranean fortress. The air in the windowless cellar grew impossibly thick, filled with the burning, caustic powder of pulverized quicklime and shattered mortar that coated the men's throats and stung their bloodshot eyes. But as the days dragged on and the mountain of shattered concrete was slowly, painfully hauled up the narrow stone steps in heavy canvas buckets, the atmosphere in the cellar began to change. The putrid, sickening smell of profound biological decay, which had initially been a faint, lingering draft, grew exponentially stronger with every solid foot of concrete the miners stripped away. It was a heavy, sweet, and overwhelmingly concentrated stench of anoxic rot that forced the hardened miners to tie thick bandanas tightly over their faces, gagging violently as they swung their heavy pickaxes into the core of the mound. Constable Reed stood in the shifting shadows, the flickering amber light of his brass kerosene lantern casting long, distorted shadows across the dust-choked room, his hand resting instinctively on the polished wooden grip of his heavy Colt revolver, waiting for the inevitable breach. On the freezing twilight of the third agonizing day, the breakthrough finally happened. A massive, soot-stained miner drove his heavy iron pickaxe deep into the absolute center of the ruined mound, aiming for a seam between 2 rusted railroad ties. But the heavy iron head did not strike solid stone, nor did it spark against hidden steel. It landed with a heavy, deeply hollow, and violently splintering thud. The miner froze, wiping a thick layer of caustic dust and sweat from his brow, and gestured frantically for the constable. Reed ordered the men to immediately drop their sledgehammers. Using only heavy steel crowbars in the gloved hands, they desperately cleared away the remaining jagged chunks of pulverized concrete and warped iron, peeling back the final layers of Margaret's protective shell to reveal the absolute epicenter of the paranoid monument. Buried at the very base of the colossal mound, resting directly against the cold, original packed earth foundation of the cellar floor, was a massive, heavy wooden shipping crate. It was constructed of incredibly thick, rough-hewn oak, heavily bound in thick, heavily rusted steel transit bands. The top of the massive wooden box was severely bowed inward, groaning and physically crushed under the immense, crushing weight of 10 years of poured concrete and heavy iron, but it had somehow managed to miraculously hold its basic structural integrity. It was not a coffin, but it had undeniably been repurposed as a subterranean tomb. Believing that they had finally uncovered the missing coal baron's violently hoarded fortune, stolen gold bullion, or the hidden ledgers of his massive gambling debts, the exhausted miners eagerly jammed the flattened ends of their heavy iron crowbars beneath the rusted steel bands. With a collective, agonizing heave, the rusted metal violently snapped, echoing sharply like a gunshot in the confined space. They wedged their tools beneath the thick, crushed oak lid and violently pried it upward. The rusted iron nails screamed in protest as the heavy wood was torn free, and a blast of hot, incredibly putrid, and entirely concentrated decay violently erupted from the dark interior of the crate, sending two of the hardened miners stumbling backward into the dust, violently vomiting onto the stone floor. Constable Reed did not step back. He stepped forward, pulling a handkerchief tightly over his nose and mouth, and lowered his brass kerosene lantern directly over the shattered opening of the massive wooden box. The flickering, weak ember light did not illuminate stacks of pristine gold double eagles or wrapped bundles of stolen currency. It illuminated the heavily mummified, leathery, and grotesquely preserved remains of Elias Hemlock. The missing coal baron had not abandoned his wife in the dead of winter. He had not fled his massive debts in a black carriage. The terrifying truth of the last decade instantly crystallized in Reed's logical mind. Margaret Hemlock had murdered her cruel, tyrannical husband to escape his absolute, feudal control. But her profound, deeply ingrained trauma, combined with an absolute, paralyzing terror of the monstrous man, had birthed an unfathomable paranoia. She had convinced herself, in the fractured, terrifying logic of an abused mind, that Elias was a monster who could simply refuse to die, that he would eventually rise from his shallow grave to exact his brutal, unimaginable vengeance upon her. She had built the colossal concrete mound not just to hide his body from the law, but to physically, desperately ensure he could never, ever claw his way back up to the surface. But as Constable Reed leaned closer, his eyes scanning the horrific, sunken, parchment-like features of the mummified coal baron, a new, entirely separate wave of pure, paralyzing dread washed over him. He lowered the lantern slightly, illuminating the underside of the heavy, splintered oak lid they had just violently pried off, and the thick, interior wooden walls of the massive shipping crate. His blood turned to absolute, freezing ice in his veins. The horror of Hemlock Manor was not simply the product of a grieving widow's delusional paranoia. The inner walls of the solid oak crate were completely, violently, and systematically destroyed. The thick, rough-hewn wood was deeply gouged, severely splintered, and heavily stained with vast, dried, and heavily oxidized smears of dark black blood. And covering every single inch of the interior surface, carved with a frantic, agonizing, and entirely desperate ferocity, were thousands upon thousands of overlapping, deeply grooved scratch marks. The heavy iron plates that Margaret had laid directly on top of the crate before pouring the very first layer of concrete were similarly, horrifically scored with the frantic, metallic scraping of shattered human fingernails and exposed bone. The widow of Raven Valley hadn't been hallucinating a monster trying to break out. She had been sitting in the dark, armed and terrified, guarding a man who was very much awake. Awake, and fighting with every last, agonizing ounce of his brutal strength to claw his way out of the suffocating dark. The profound, stomach-churning horror of the shattered shipping crate brought the massive, soot-stained miners to an absolute, paralyzed standstill, the heavy iron crowbars slipping from their trembling, calloused hands to ring sharply against the stone floor. Constable Silas Reed, his face pale and slick with a freezing sweat despite the suffocating heat of the enclosed cellar, ordered the men to step back against the far wall. He did not touch the mummified remains. Instead, he dispatched his terrified young deputy back out into the blinding, howling blizzard to fetch the county medical examiner, a grim, hardened man named Dr. Vance, who arrived hours later smelling strongly of cheap gin and carbolic acid. When the doctor finally descended into the dust-choked, putrid depths of the foundation, he did not find a traditional murder scene. As he carefully examined the leathery, desiccated remains of the missing coal baron under the flickering, unsteady amber light of 3 brass lanterns, the physical evidence began to tell a story far more terrifying than a simple crime of passion. Dr. Vance ran his gloved hands over Elias Hemlock's skull. There were no fractures, no heavy indentations from a blunt instrument. He checked the mummified torso. There were no bullet holes, no jagged, fatal stab wounds that would indicate a violent, bloody struggle in the upper floors of the Grand Manor. The massive, cruel man had been placed into the heavy oak crate entirely physically intact. But as the coroner systematically examined the Baron's extremities, he paused, a low, highly disturbed breath hissing through his teeth. He lifted Elias's right hand into the lantern light. The fingertips were completely, utterly destroyed. They had been worn down past the skin, past the muscle, violently scraping against the solid oak interior until the stark, white bone of the distal phalanges was entirely exposed. The fingernails had been ripped completely from their nail beds, and hundreds of thick, jagged wooden splinters were driven deeply into the petrified, blackened tissue of his hands and forearms. The clinical, terrifying confirmation of the timeline was eventually discovered later that evening, tucked away inside a small, rotting wooden lockbox resting beneath Margaret's rocking chair. Among the few scattered, meaningless trinkets from her former life was a collection of empty, dark glass apothecary vials. The faded, deeply stained paper labels bore the unmistakable markings of a highly potent, heavy-grade paralytic extract, a massive, dangerous muscle relaxant typically utilized by local mountain veterinarians to sedate massive draft horses for brutal surgeries. Constable Reed stood in the freezing, cavernous cellar, the caustic stone dust settling slowly around him, and felt the sheer, crushing psychological weight of the last 10 years violently reconstruct itself in his mind. In the dead, chaotic winter of 1874, Margaret Hemlock, pushed to the absolute breaking brink of human endurance by years of horrific, unrecorded physical and psychological torment, had not poisoned her husband to kill him. She had slipped a massive, overwhelming dose of the heavy veterinary paralytic into his evening glass of imported brandy. Elias's massive heart had kept beating, but his voluntary muscles had completely, violently locked down. He had collapsed onto the expensive Persian rugs of the grand parlor, entirely conscious, his eyes darting wildly in absolute terror as he realized he was a prisoner inside his own paralyzed flesh. She had dragged his immense, dead weight down the narrow stone stairs, the agonizing, rhythmic thud of his limp body echoing in the dark. She had rolled him into the heavy oak shipping crate, and as the paralytic held him entirely captive, he had felt the rough wood beneath his back. He had smelled the damp, freezing earth. He had watched, entirely unable to move a single muscle or scream for mercy, as his wife positioned the heavy oak lid just inches from his face, and violently drove the long, rusted iron nails into the wood, sealing him forever in the absolute pitch black. But it was the agonizing aftermath of the burial that had permanently fractured the widow of Raven Valley's mind. Reed looked at the empty wooden rocking chair, and then down at the splintered crate, measuring the terrifyingly short distance between them. Margaret had likely locked the cellar door and climbed back upstairs, breathing a ragged sigh of terrified relief. But then, hours later, as the heavy paralytic finally, agonizingly began to burn its way out of Elias's system, she heard it. In the dead, suffocating silence of the massive house, a faint, muffled, deeply desperate scraping sound began to vibrate up through the wooden floorboards. The absolute, mind-shattering realization hit her: the monster was not dead. And he was trying to break out. Her trauma was so profound, her terror so deeply ingrained, that she did not flee the manor into the blizzard. The abuse had chained her to the house. She had run back down into the freezing cellar, grabbed Elias's heavy, double-barreled shotgun, and violently locked the massive oak door from the inside, trapping herself in the pitch black with her nightmare. She had dragged the rocking chair to the very edge of the wooden crate and sat down. For days, Margaret sat in the dark, shaking violently, her finger resting heavily on the twin triggers, listening to the agonizing, muffled screams of her husband slowly suffocating beneath her boots. She listened to him frantically, desperately tear his own hands to shreds against the solid oak. the heavy, violent thuds of his shoulders slamming against the lid as the wood groaned under his dying, terrified strength. Eventually, the oxygen inside the sealed crate ran out. The violent, desperate thrashing slowed to weak, rhythmic scratches, and finally, absolute, permanent, and crushing silence. Elias Hemlock suffocated in the dark, his hands ruined, his lungs burning for air. But for Margaret, the silence was not a comfort, it was a deeply paranoid trick. The gruesome reality of her revenge had permanently destroyed her sanity. To a victim of such profound terror, the monster is immortal. She could never be absolutely certain he wouldn't wake up again, that he wouldn't somehow claw his way through the wood and drag her down into the earth with him. So, she began to build. She ordered the roll cement, the caustic quicklime, the heavy iron railroad ties. 10 years of manic, terrifying, back-breaking labor, pouring hundreds of pounds of stone over his grave every single week, fortifying the subterranean tomb just in case the scratching ever started again. The sheer, agonizing gravity of this localized tragedy left the men completely speechless. The miners packed up their heavy iron tools in absolute, unbroken silence, their faces pale and haunted beneath the soot. The mummified remains of Elias Hemlock and the tragic, emaciated corpse of his wife were quietly removed from the estate in the dead of night. They were buried in unmarked, entirely unrecorded graves at the absolute furthest edge of the county cemetery, far from the hallowed ground of the church and far away from each other. The local magistrate, deeply disturbed by the horrific discoveries, ordered Hemlock Manor permanently condemned. Heavy, forged iron chains were wrapped tightly around the front doors, and every single window was aggressively boarded shut with incredibly thick pine planks, sealing the decaying Victorian estate away from the world. Constable Silas Reed, profoundly changed and deeply haunted by the terrifying, practically limitless capacity for human cruelty, paranoia, and psychological endurance, submitted his formal resignation to the state precinct less than a week later. He packed his meager belongings into a small leather satchel and boarded the very first commercial coal train out of the freezing, soot-stained valley, never once looking back at the jagged black granite ridge. The massive estate was left entirely to rot, slowly and inevitably reclaimed by the aggressive, creeping mountain briars and the howling, unforgiving winter winds. But the deeply superstitious locals of Raven Valley strictly avoid the overgrown property line to this day. Because they say, if you stand near the rusted iron grates of the foundation on a freezing, completely silent night, you do not hear the moans of ghosts or the rattling of chains. You just feel the crushing, heavy, and absolute silence of a 10-year nightmare finally coming to an end, and the lingering, terrifying weight of the dark secret buried permanently beneath the stone.